Well, there was a variety of things that inspired the abolitionist movement. The first organized body of Americans to oppose slavery were Quakers, the Society of Friends. Later on, in the 19th century, they were joined by people coming out of other churches, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists. The Quakers, I should say, began organizing against slavery in the mid-18th century, even in the colonial period, and were often the leaders of early anti-slavery organizations. Now, there I'm just talking about white Americans. Black Americans, in a sense, were always anti-slavery. People who were themselves coming out of slavery had family members who were enslaved. And the anti-slavery movement as a whole, but much more particularly its cutting edge, its radical activist wing, the Underground Railroad, functioned and it succeeded because of the synergy amongst both white and black Americans. The Underground Railroad has to be understood as the first biracial political movement in American history. It was always integrated. The Underground Railroad was in many areas organized, led, sometimes financed by African Americans. So we're talking about the inspiration of people. For most white Americans, the inspiration came from religious faith. And indeed, it's best to understand the Underground Railroad as an expression of religion, as part of a religious movement, a spiritual movement, rather than a political one. It becomes political only as you get closer to the Civil War, from after the 1830s. The evangelical revival of the early 19th century turbocharged abolitionism. It brought a passionate religious fervency to anti-slavery activity. And I'm convinced that for most white activists in the Underground Railroad, they tended to see underground activity as something like prayer in action, living out their religion by fighting the sin of slavery. Now, feeding into their motivation as well were the Enlightenment ideals as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the whole cluster of more secular ideas of political liberation that became popularized around the time of the American Revolution and in the early Republic. So you had a religious inspiration, and you had also an idealistic philosophical inspiration as well. African Americans, who by and large, with few exceptions, didn't have the privilege of being educated as white Americans did, but nonetheless understood slavery firsthand, didn't really need to go through the medium of theology in order to become anti-slavery. Again and again and again in the narratives left by former slaves, and there are many of them, people describe their personal, visceral hatred of slavery and their motivation to do abolitionist work as just a profound personal craving to bring freedom to other people who are still enslaved.